What you're about to hear is a political earthquake, a courtroom clash that turned one fine into a national reckoning. Caroline Leavitt, the youngest White House press secretary in history, took on a powerful federal judge, and what followed sent shockwaves through the justice system. The Arizona sun hung low and relentless over Phoenix as armored SUVs rolled toward the Arizona District Federal Courthouse. Inside one of them sat Caroline Leavitt, 27 years old, the youngest White House press secretary in U.S. history, and a lightning rod in Trump's second administration. Today, she wasn't behind a podium. She wasn't holding a press briefing. She was walking into a federal courtroom not to defend policy, but to confront the aftermath of it. The hearing, initially intended as a review of former President Biden's immigration directives, had escalated into a public reckoning. Supporters and protesters swarmed the courthouse steps. On one side, flags bearing Caroline's name snapped in the dry wind, surrounded by chants of "Defend our border." On the other, progressive activists hoisted banners accusing her of hate speech and authoritarianism. Police in riot gear tried and failed to hold a neutral line. Caroline's SUV slowed as a crowd surged, reporters banging on the window, lenses pressed against the glass. She didn't flinch. Clad in a tailored navy blazer and desert-toned heels, she stepped out, her expression unreadable, her purpose unmistakable. Protesters shouted, supporters cheered, flashbulbs popped, and Caroline, eyes fixed on the courthouse doors, walked forward like she was marching into a war zone. Behind her, agents cleared a path. Ahead of her, Judge Malcolm Reyes, a Biden appointee with a notorious reputation for political bias, waited on the bench. Caroline had not come to appease him. She had come to make a statement, and whether the courtroom liked it or not, they were about to hear it live. The stakes surrounding the hearing weren't just procedural. They were political dynamite. At the heart of the controversy was a set of executive orders signed during the final months of the Biden administration, which loosened border enforcement and redirected resources away from detention and deportation. Critics on the right had long dubbed them the border betrayals, blaming them for a surge in undocumented immigration, cartel activity along the southern corridor, and economic strain on border state communities. When President Trump returned to office, his administration launched a full-scale review of what they called deliberate negligence disguised as policy. The Arizona District Federal Court became ground zero for this reckoning, particularly because it was presided over by Judge Malcolm Reyes, a jurist seen by many conservatives as the legal face of Biden's border leniency. Reyes had made headlines before, dismissing lawsuits against sanctuary cities, fining conservative plaintiffs for migrants that critics argued defied constitutional order. His courtroom had become a symbol of the institutional rot Trump's base believed needed purging. But this hearing was unique. While Caroline Leavitt was not an attorney nor a formal litigant, she had been invited to deliver a public statement on behalf of the Trump administration, something both strategic and symbolic. Her presence sent a clear message. This wasn't just about legal precedent, it was about narrative control. It was about who defined the truth. The Biden camp had labeled her inclusion in the trial a publicity stunt, but her allies saw it differently. To them, Caroline wasn't just Trump's press secretary, she was his voice in the fire, his chosen messenger to confront the judiciary head-on. With the eyes of the nation glued to Arizona, the courtroom had morphed from a legal venue into a political battleground. Caroline's looming statement wasn't just about immigration policy, it was about exposing, in her words, a crumbling legacy of lawlessness. And with Judge Reyes known for cutting dissent short, tensions were already stretched to their breaking point. What happened next would determine more than just the court's tone. It would define the battle lines for the administration's broader war on institutional bias. The moment Caroline Leavitt stepped into the courtroom, the atmosphere thickened with anticipation. Judge Malcolm Reyes sat perched on the bench, his silver hair gleaming under the courtroom lights, his expression as unreadable as it was unforgiving. Reporters filled the gallery, pens poised, cameras rolling, their attention laser-focused on the podium at the center. Caroline walked toward it with measured, deliberate steps, heels clicking against the marble floor, like a countdown to impact. Dressed in a crisp navy suit with an American flag pin on her lapel, she exuded calm precision, but her eyes burned with unspoken defiance. Judge Reyes barely concealed his disapproval as he announced the session's purpose: a formal review of abuse of power allegations tied to former President Biden's immigration policies. Then he gestured for Caroline to speak, adding curtly, "Keep it factual. This is not a campaign rally." Caroline placed her notes aside. She didn't need them. "With respect, Your Honor," she began, voice cool and unwavering, "I'm not here to perform. I'm here to speak truth. On behalf of millions." She locked eyes with Reyes, then turned to the audience. "Let's be clear, the Biden administration didn't just fail at border control. They abandoned it. They opened the gates and turned their backs while cartels, criminals, and chaos poured through." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Reyes struck his gavel once. "Ms. Leavitt, stick to the policy facts." "These are the facts," she snapped back, her tone sharpening. "Americans died, towns were overrun, and your courtroom upheld the policies that caused it." The room tensed. Reyes glared. "You're bordering on contempt," he warned. Caroline didn't blink. "Then charge me," she said, lifting her chin. "But I won't lie to make this courtroom comfortable." Reporters scrambled to transcribe her words. The back row, packed with Trump supporters, stirred. And then, Reyes did it. He slammed the gavel again. "Effective immediately," he declared, voice thundering. "Ms. Leavitt is fined $100,000 0 cents for contempt of court." Gasps turned into shouts. Caroline didn't flinch. She calmly pulled out her phone, turned on a live stream, and held it toward her face. "The judge just fined me 6 figures for telling the truth," she said to tens of thousands watching. "Let them see who's really afraid of facts." In that instant, the courtroom stopped being a courtroom. It became a stage, and Caroline had just lit the match. As Judge Reyes's gavel echoed through the chamber, Caroline Leavitt did something no one expected. She smiled. Not with arrogance, but with calculated certainty. With a practiced flick of her thumb, she turned her phone camera to face the audience and hit "Go Live" on X. Within seconds, tens of thousands tuned in. Her voice was steady, piercing, even as the courtroom buzzed with disbelief. "The federal judge just fined me $100,000. 0 cents. She told the stream, not for lying, but for daring to speak the truth about what Biden's policies did to this country. The comment section ignited instantly. "Stand tall, Caroline. We're with you. Expose them all." Out in the hallway, a few reporters relayed her words in real time to the swarm of protesters outside, and as they were broadcast over portable speakers, chants erupted. "Caroline! Caroline!" and "Shame on Reyes." Inside, the courtroom transformed into a pressure cooker. Reyes's face darkened, knuckles tight on his gavel, but Caroline was no longer speaking to him. She had bypassed the judge and plugged directly into the American public. Her phone became her weapon, her shield, and her stage. The live viewer count leapt past 50,000, then 100, 0, growing by the second. "They think a fine will silence me," she said, eyes locked on the camera. "Let them hang the receipt on the wall. I'll frame it like a Medal of Honor." Reporters from the Desert Sentinel and Western Watch clashed in whispered arguments over whether this was courtroom defiance or the birth of a movement. Some scribbled frantically, others stopped writing altogether, transfixed by the digital wave taking shape in front of them. Judge Reyes pounded his gavel again. "Enough," he bellowed. "This is a federal courtroom, not a political arena." But it was too late. The arena had already expanded, beyond marble walls, past security checkpoints, into millions of homes and phones across the nation. Trump supporters flooded the plaza outside the courthouse. Chants turned into a roar. More reporters turned on their live streams to keep up. The momentum had shifted, and Caroline was no longer just a press secretary. She was the face of a digital uprising. As the bailiff tried to restore order, Caroline spoke once more to her phone, not with fury but with resolve. "They fear the truth because it doesn't need permission to exist," she said. "If speaking it costs me $100,000, 0 cents. So be it. But if I'm fined today, who gets silenced tomorrow?" The comment section surged, viewership crossed 200. Influencers, politicians, and commentators started reposting her words with the hashtag "Truth Costs Plenty." The courthouse was no longer the scene of a hearing. It was the epicenter of a national political earthquake, and Caroline Leavitt, live and uncensored, stood right at its fault line. While chaos unfurled inside the Arizona District Courthouse and Caroline's livestream surged past 200,000 viewers, over 100 miles away in a high-security DOJ operations center in Flagstaff, U.S. Attorney General Pam Bondi watched in silence. Her eyes never left the screen as Caroline's voice rang out, cool and defiant, declaring she'd rather frame a $100.00 fine than let truth be buried. Around her, aides exchanged anxious glances. Bondi didn't flinch. She had anticipated this moment for months. Judge Malcolm Reyes had been on her radar long before today, flagged in a covert DOJ investigation for issuing questionable rulings, targeting conservative litigants with disproportionate penalties and allegedly dismissing evidence unfavorable to progressive causes. But there had never been a public spark big enough to act on until now. Bondi rose slowly, her black blazer brushing against the edge of the briefing table, and turned to her senior legal advisor, Rebecca Vaughn. "Get me the Reyes file," she said calmly. Rebecca was already ahead of her, sliding the thick folder across the polished surface. Bondi flipped it open. Hundreds of pages of sealed depositions, case reviews, and internal memos, all pointing to a pattern of judicial abuse and partisan bias. Her gaze locked on one document, a memo outlining Reyes's prior fine of $50,000 against a Republican state senator for merely refusing to disclose internal communications, an act some DOJ lawyers called barely defensible. She closed the file with a firm snap. "Call Hank Dalton," she instructed. "Tell him the warrant we prepped last week is going active. Now." Rebecca blinked. "You're making the arrest public?" Bondi nodded. They made it public the moment Reyes tried to silence Caroline in front of 500,000 Americans. Her phone was already dialing. On the other end, U.S. Marshal Commander Hank Dalton answered with a crisp, "Yes, Madam Attorney General?" "Hank, this is Bondi. Reyes just fined a sitting press secretary $100,000 for speaking against Biden-era policies. We've got enough evidence to sink him twice. I want your team at the courthouse in 15 minutes, warrant in hand." "Understood. We're already mobilized, ETA 10 minutes. Bondi ended the call and turned back to the room. "We're not just protecting free speech," she said. "We're protecting the rule of law from people who've twisted it into a weapon." Aides scrambled to coordinate the deployment. DOJ vehicles roared to life. In the corner, a monitor showed Caroline's stream hitting 300,000 live viewers. Bondi watched for a beat longer, her eyes steely. "This is bigger than a trial," she muttered. "It's a reckoning." As she stepped out of the room, flanked by security, one final order rang out: "Tell the media nothing, until the cuffs click." And with that, the DOJ moved, swift, silent, and ready to make history. By the time Caroline Leavitt's live stream ticked past 400,000 viewers, the atmosphere around the Arizona District Courthouse had become electric, unstable, volatile, and ready to explode. Outside, the crowds had more than doubled in size. On one side, desert defenders, Trump loyalists waving flags and chanting Caroline's name, packed the courthouse steps. On the other, the Border Unity Coalition held signs reading, "Defend democracy, not tyranny," their chants rising in defiance. Riot police struggled to hold the thin, trembling line between them. Protesters shoved. Bottles flew. A megaphone blared over the crowd. $100.00 for speaking truth? What's next? Jail for asking questions. Caroline's own words from the live stream echoed through portable speakers, fueling the fury. Inside the courthouse, tension sliced through the air like a razor. Reporters barked into phones, cameras rolled non-stop, and the murmurs of spectators turned into audible confrontation. Judge Malcolm Reyes, now visibly shaken beneath his calm facade, gripped his gavel like it was the only anchor he had left. "Ms. Leavitt," he growled, "shut off that camera or I'll have you forcibly removed." But Caroline didn't blink. She raised the phone higher. "The people are watching, Judge Reyes," she said, her voice laced with steel. They saw your fine, now they'll see your fear." The room erupted. Trump supporters in the gallery stood and applauded. Progressives shouted her down. One activist in the back screamed, "You're destroying the legal system." Reyes slammed his gavel over and over, but the sound was swallowed by the chaos. "Order! I will not tolerate anarchy in my courtroom," he roared, but no one listened. The balance of power had shifted. Caroline wasn't just a press secretary anymore. She was a symbol, and symbols don't yield. A loud bang cracked from outside. The glass panels near the front doors trembled as the crowd surged forward, chanting, "Caroline! Caroline!" A court officer rushed to the bench. "Sir, the protest's escalating. We're losing control." Reyes looked toward the doors, his complexion paling. Inside the courtroom, reporters scrambled for position, some narrating live, others typing headlines like, "Courtroom Meltdown in Phoenix," and "Trump's press secretary sparks uprising." Still at the podium, Caroline stood tall, her phone streaming, her voice cutting through the din. "You can fine me, threaten me, shout me down, but you can't silence the truth. And you can't silence millions." Judge Reyes stood, his face flushed with rage, and pointed directly at her. "If you say one more word, I will hold you in further contempt and order your arrest on the spot." Caroline locked eyes with him, her lips curling into the kind of smile that signaled the storm was just beginning. She didn't need to say another word. Outside, sirens wailed. Inside, the court fractured. And in that suspended moment, before the doors burst open, every camera turned, every voice hushed, and every eye waited for what came next. The wooden doors of the Arizona District Courthouse burst open like the first crack of a desert thunderstorm. A hush fell over the chaos inside as heads turned toward the source of the disruption. There, striding with the weight of authority and a storm in her step, was Pam Bondi, U.S. Attorney General under President Trump. Dressed in a sharp black suit, heels clicking like war drums against the marble, Bondi's presence cut through the room like a blade. Flanking her were 4 U.S. Marshals, eyes hidden behind dark glasses, hands resting on holstered weapons. In her right hand, a sealed arrest warrant, the Department of Justice's red emblem shining under the overhead lights. Caroline Leavitt's live stream swung to capture the moment, the screen trembling with energy as her voice echoed through millions of phones. "Justice has entered the building." Judge Malcolm Reyes, still gripping his gavel, froze at the sight of her. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, voice cracking beneath the weight of tension. Bondi didn't flinch. She stepped forward until she stood squarely at the center of the courtroom, her voice steady, cold, and unmistakably final. "Judge Malcolm Reyes," she declared, "you are under federal investigation for abuse of judicial authority, political bias, and unlawful punitive action against government officials. Your fine of $100,000 against White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt, issued in retaliation for a lawful public statement, was the final act in a pattern of corruption." The gallery gasped, reporters leapt from their seats, cameras clicked wildly. Reyes sputtered, rising from the bench. "You have no jurisdiction to do this. I am a federal judge." Pam Bondi lifted the warrant, the gold lettering catching the light. "We do have jurisdiction. We've been investigating you for 6 months. This warrant is signed, sealed, and authorized under federal authority. You're done, Judge." She nodded to the marshals. "Cuff him." The courtroom erupted. Trump supporters stood cheering, clapping wildly as Reyes stumbled backward in disbelief. "This is a circus! This is political persecution!" he shouted, but his voice was lost in the frenzy. 2 marshals ascended the bench, seized his arms, and clamped the cuffs shut with a cold final click. The judge, who had moments earlier tried to silence a press secretary, was now being dragged from his own courtroom in disgrace. Caroline's camera stayed focused, capturing every frame. "This is what happens when accountability arrives," she said into the stream. "This is what the system fears." Outside, the crowd heard the news through loudspeakers and phones. Judge Reyes had been arrested. A roar exploded through the plaza. "Justice! Justice!" they chanted. Inside, Reyes looked back at Bondi and Caroline as he was escorted out, his face red, eyes filled with fury. "You'll regret this," he spat. Bondi's reply was ice cold. "You dug your own grave. Today's just harvest day." As the doors slammed behind him, the courtroom became ground zero for a movement, and Caroline's live stream exploded past 600,000 viewers. Pam Bondi turned to her team and said only one word: next. The shockwaves of Judge Malcolm Reyes' arrest didn't just ripple through Arizona, they detonated across the nation. Within minutes, every major news network broke into programming with urgent banners: federal judge arrested, live in courtroom. Conservative outlets hailed the moment as a long-overdue reckoning, declaring Caroline Leavitt and Pam Bondi the vanguard of the justice revival. Right-wing commentators flooded social media with praise, posting freeze frames of Reyes in cuffs alongside hashtags like "System Collapse" and "Truth Unleashed." Meanwhile, progressive newsrooms went into damage control. MSNBC ran a chyron that read, "DOJ overreach?" Critics claim authoritarian tactics in live arrest, and legal scholars debated whether Bondi's moves signaled bold accountability or a dangerous precedent of politicizing the courts. The divide was instant, deep, and emotionally charged. In the DOJ's Western Command Office, Bondi watched the frenzy unfold, calm and collected. Her inbox exploded with support from state attorneys general across red states. One message read, "It's about time we stopped playing defense." Her team launched what they called the Justice Cleanup Campaign, a formal review of judges suspected of political bias or misconduct. Reyes was only the beginning. Meanwhile, Caroline's live stream continued surging. Over 700,000 people had tuned in by the time she exited the courthouse steps, flanked by security and greeted with cheers like a returning war hero. Phones were held high, flags waved. "Caroline, voice of freedom," supporters chanted. She raised her phone once more and declared, "This is what happens when the people show up. When we speak, the system shakes." Across social media, reactions boiled. Former President Trump tweeted, "Proud of Caroline and Pam, this is the America we fight for." Some liberal lawmakers called for an investigation into Bondi's use of DOJ resources, but no formal motion stuck. The momentum was with Caroline. She wasn't just a press secretary anymore, she was a movement. What had begun as a courtroom hearing had morphed into a national reckoning with power, truth, and accountability. And while the country debated, one fact was clear: the arrest of Judge Reyes had shattered the illusion of neutrality and ushered in a new era of bold, unapologetic justice. The next morning, under a sky as blistering as the headlines burning across America, Caroline Leavitt stepped into the Arizona State Capitol's temporary press room, now flooded with more reporters than it had space to hold. The podium gleamed beneath the lights, but it wasn't the mic or the Trump administration's seal that stole attention. It was the framed $100,000 0-cents fine receipt hung behind her, proudly mounted like a war medal. Flashes erupted the moment she appeared, dressed in the same navy blazer she wore in court, unbothered, unflinching. Reporters shouted questions, but she raised her hand and silence fell. "Yesterday," she began, her voice calm but laced with fire, "they tried to make an example out of me. They fined me for telling the truth, but I stood my ground, and now the system is the one on trial." Applause broke out from the back of the room, where aides and Trump supporters had gathered, streaming the event live to hundreds of thousands still tuned in across the country. "Judge Malcolm Reyes was exposed," Caroline continued, "but he wasn't an outlier, he was a symptom, and yesterday, thanks to Attorney General Bondi, we began treating the disease." She gestured toward the framed receipt. "I won't pay this fine, I'll frame it. So every time they try to silence me again, they remember how that ended." Her words hit harder than any press release. They were personal, defiant. Political theater turned into political power. When a Fox News reporter asked if she feared retaliation, Caroline didn't hesitate. "Let them come," she said, smiling coldly. "I'm not here to be protected. I'm here to protect the truth." At DOJ headquarters, Pam Bondi watched the live feed, arms crossed, nodding approvingly as her phone lit up with updates. New judicial reviews opened, files pulled, next targets identified. Back in the briefing room, Caroline ended the session not with a question, but with a declaration. "We didn't win a headline, we started a movement," she said, stepping away from the mic. And with that, she returned to her office. Not as the embattled press secretary, but as the new face of a fight that had only just begun. As the dust settled over Arizona, it became clear that Judge Malcolm Reyes was only the first domino to fall. At the Department of Justice's Western Operations Division, Pam Bondi stood before a table stacked with thick manila folders, each one labeled with a name, each one tied to a judge or official suspected of abusing power under the previous administration. She didn't hesitate. "These 12 are next," she told her team, her voice like steel wrapped in ice. "I want full audits, everything they've touched, rulings, fines, dismissals, campaign ties, no more shadows. We clean it all." The room moved into motion, agents and legal analysts scrambling as Bondi opened a new operation, the Justice Cleanup Campaign, Phase 2. Across red state legal networks, messages pinged back and forth, state attorneys general offering help, conservative watchdogs feeding evidence, political strategists preparing for battle. The Reyes takedown had sent a signal. The Trump administration wasn't content with controlling the White House, they were going for the courts. Meanwhile, back in Phoenix, Caroline Leavitt sat in her office, overlooking the Arizona state capitol. The framed $100,000 0-cent fine still hung on the wall behind her desk, its presence more symbolic than decorative, a reminder of the cost of truth and the power of defiance. Her phone buzzed with updates. DOJ confirms investigation into Ninth Circuit judge. Bondi preparing federal review of Michigan District Court. She scrolled through comments on her X stream. "Caroline is our fighter. Reyes down. Who's next? Clean house." Her following had ballooned past 5 million in a matter of days, but she wasn't interested in fame. She was interested in momentum. A knock at her door pulled her from the screen. An aide entered, holding a classified DOJ envelope. "Madam Press Secretary," he said, handing it over. "It's from Bondi. You're going to want to see this." Inside were profiles of judges with politically lopsided records, court audio clips, and one handwritten note from Bondi. "Your stand lit the match. Let's burn the rot out." Caroline didn't smile. She nodded. She knew the road ahead would be brutal. The media would attack, legal organizations would accuse them of weaponizing the DOJ. But it didn't matter. The old guard had held the gavel for too long. That afternoon, Caroline walked into the White House press room in front of a roaring crowd of conservative media and supporters. She didn't take questions. She simply raised her phone, went live, and said, "Reyes was never the end. He was the beginning. We've uncovered more, and we're not stopping until every courtroom in this country is ruled by justice, not agenda." Outside, protests clashed. Inside, Caroline's voice rang out to millions. The war for the system wasn't over. It had just entered its next phase. The story of Caroline Leavitt and Pam Bondi teaches a powerful lesson about the intersection of truth, power, and courage in an age of institutional distrust. When Caroline was fined $100,000 0 for speaking out against policies she believed were harmful, she could have backed down. Instead, she turned the punishment into a platform and ignited a nationwide movement. Her defiance in the courtroom revealed how systems meant to uphold justice can be weaponized to silence dissent. But more importantly, it showed that one voice, when amplified through conviction and modern technology, can challenge even the most entrenched authority. Pam Bondi's arrival cemented the story's core message. Accountability must go both ways. Judges, like politicians, are not untouchable. True justice demands courage not just in speaking truth, but in acting on it even when the world is watching. Together, Caroline and Bondi demonstrated that defending truth may come at a cost, but the price of silence is far greater. In a polarized world where narratives battle for dominance, this story reminds us the system isn't sacred, only justice is. And sometimes, it takes a single moment of boldness to begin cleaning out the rot that hides behind robes and rules.